The Lost Treasure of King John, written and read by Christopher Halton. It was just another research day at Montague House, a privately owned country home south of the Wash in Norfolk. Its origins date from the era of King John, when it was initially built in the year 1230 as a fortified manor house by Sir Simon de Montfort, a confidant of King John who had earlier accompanied him and his baggage train across the dangerous sands of the Wash, a large tidal expanse of mud and sand that separates both counties of Norfolk and Lincolnshire. It was said that Sir Simon witnessed the devastating loss of the train to a tidal surge that swept away men, horses and valuables. A king's ransom of treasure was never seen again, as all was consumed into the Wash. Others claim that Sir Simon saved King John from the fate that beset his train, but these stories are likely fictitious and unverified by any documentation. To this end, I was employed by a commercial exploration company, Farley Investments, to delve into the legend to pinpoint and retrieve the lost treasure. Farley Investments was very successful in its business of finding treasure shipwrecks. Still, the Wash represented an entirely new venture and a complex spectrum of engineering, as the dig area would not be underwater, but instead on a designated surface area protected by a sizable waterproof cofferdam. Of course, such an operation would be costly, therefore failure was not an option, as it would severely affect their bottom line. To this end, I was given a few months to resolve these difficulties as a medievalist historian on a sabbatical from Cambridge University. This partly explains why I am at Montague House, as the owner, Lord Moorcroft, permitted me to examine the extensive library to find possible clues from a large cache of medieval documents. I was very excited, as the library outside of universities is regarded to be one of the finest. I am, by way of introduction, Professor Ian Housman, proudly regarded as one of Britain's definitive authorities in the medievalist world. In the past, I have won accolades for my research work across Europe. The Wash, I knew from the outset, would present itself as one of the most significant challenges of my career. As previously, so many other academics have failed to find this missing hoard. I recall that one of the principal arguments against finding it is the contention that over the centuries the Wash has changed shape, making the verification of historical locations very difficult, and further, from an engineering perspective, that the treasure caught up in the soft sand and mud of the Wash is more than likely to have moved from where it was initially lost. In answer to the location argument, I was fortunate to have previously compiled enough data based on other documents to recreate what the Wash physically looked like in the 13th century, and to overlay this information onto a modern map for context. But the thought of the treasure not being near where it was lost daunted me, but regardless, I pressed on. Assisting me at the library was another academic, an Australian, Celia Duncan, who was employed as the librarian and instructed by Lord Moorcroft to allow access to everything retained in the library, and also the library vaults where many loose documents were stored in a temperature-controlled dry environment. Part of this evident excitement was that many of these documents had never been seen by anyone outside Moorcroft's employ. It should be noted that the Moorcroft family are lineal descendants, and the family name was a corruption of their ancestor, Simon de Montfort. Celia was an attractive woman in her late 30s who was average height and had long shoulder-length dark hair. She originated from Sydney in Australia, and ancestrally she had once family members living in the area. Her branch moved to Australia in the 1920s during the recession. Her locality knowledge was considerable, and I hoped her input would help me. As Lord Moorcroft lived in London, Celia was his designated authority, and any decisions were left to her jurisprudence. It should also be noted that Moorcroft was also a significant shareholder of Farley Investments, and as such, his support for my research was purely fiscal. In its present incarnation, Montague House was built in the Palladian style of architecture in 1720, although the cellars were original to the 13th century. There was talk that the cellars contained a secret tunnel, but nothing material supports that notion. My interest was in the temperature-controlled document vault, which has an invaluable collection of medieval documents and manuscripts. Within that area was a smaller reading room where I spent considerable time researching these items. One document that caught my eye was written in Old English and dated from the 14th century. It referenced the legend of the royal sceptre lost in the Wash that held the power of death and life depending upon those who had it and for whatever intention. Apparently, and if you can believe this, the sceptre was why the king lost his baggage train. Unfortunately, the document does not provide further references or an explanation. I am aware that the current royal collection of crown jewels were replacements after Cromwell melted them down following the English Civil War, and King John's crown jewels were the originals lost in the Wash. The excitement of even this obscure document written by a local chronicler filled me with anticipation that I could help restore the jewels to the throne. Strangely, working alone in the quiet stillness of the cellars makes one a little hypersensitive to any noise or smell, and for a few days I have noticed something move across the document vault from the corner of my eye. It was barely imperceptible, and I sometimes blamed the bright lights and my tiredness from working such long hours researching. However, these events can happen at any time, regardless of whether or not I suffer from fatigue. There also is the occasional accompaniment of a faint but quite potent sulphurous smell, which I deduced as a drainage fault, as many pipes relating to the heating and sewerage system are also located here. But without further research, I am confident it must be the cause. But anyway. I later saw Celia in her office on the first floor, which looked like, from its size, it had once been a bedroom. This made perfect sense, as the house had 47 empty or unused bedrooms. Being very informal, Celia told me to call whenever I needed help or advice. A perfect moment presented itself to me when I saw that her door was open, and so, having tapped a cursory knock on the door, I wandered to where, at her invitation, I sat in front of her desk. Celia smiled and, putting down her pen, said, "How are you getting along with the documents, Ian? Have you found the crown jewels yet?" I smiled and replied, "Not the jewels, but a legend concerning the king's sceptre." "Really?" she responded with amazement. "Tell me more." Well, a 14th century chronicler from Lincolnshire spoke of the sceptre as the cause for the loss of the king's baggage train. According to legend, the sceptre holds the power of life and death for whoever holds it. I've never heard of that. This is the only document that references this. How about you, Celia? She looked at me with curious awe and said, "You are surely joking. I have never heard that tale and presumed the king lost everything as he left, crossing the Wash too late to avoid the sweeping tide." I agreed with her, but the tale remains that it may be true. Celia said, "Well, you've been working on this for a good week now, and I must add that I do not expect a miracle, but wonder how long you envisage working down there in the vault." I explained that there were over 300 medieval books in the library I had yet to research, and the best part of 500 documents in the vault. I didn't expect to be finished before the end of the month, barely 3 weeks away in April. In a matter-of-fact voice, she put on her glasses and retrieved her pen before saying, "You must excuse me now, Ian. I have a conference call to make, and I appreciate the update. Please keep me in the loop on this one." With that, I agreed and left. Of course, I didn't share the strange incidents with her. After all, I am an emeritus professor of medieval history and not some ghost hunter. And despite my reservations, I genuinely believed it would be easily and logically explainable, like the king's sceptre. The following day, the house received a visit from an elderly gentleman of the parish who claimed he had information regarding the loss of the king's treasure and wanted to share it for a reward. He had seen one of the many advertisements I had placed in every shop in the district for information. I left the document vault to meet this man in the drawing room, where a staff member had escorted him. I admit I didn't want to be disturbed, but he might have information that would shorten my research time. When I arrived, the man stood by the fireplace admiring the room while resting an arm on a silver walking stick. He was very tall, slim, and around 75 years old. Elegantly dressed, wearing a 3/4 length dark Crombie coat and sporting a mass of grey hair as he played with a wide-brimmed hat in his hands. As I approached him, he turned towards me and said, "Ah, I presume you are this professor chap I've read about on countless notice boards. I am certain I can help you." I greeted him and ushered him to sit. I was certainly intrigued. This man was well-spoken, presumably educated, and not the average person to respond to my request. I introduced myself and arranged with the kitchen for 2 coffees to be brought to the drawing room whilst we chatted. He told me his name was Howard Devell, and he held ownership of several essential documents written by court scribes to King John around the time of the tragedy in the Wash. Intrigued further, I inquired whether he could grant me access to them to assist in my research. I explained why I was researching and suggested that if the documents assisted in finding the lost baggage train, there would be a significant reward based on the value of any recovered items. He sat there resting his hands on the walking stick and replied, No, that isn't why I'm here. I want to restore the lost crown jewels to the royal estate, and I am making this gesture out of loyalty to the king. You know, patriotism and all that stuff." I asked how he had historically essential documents neither the state nor the royal family possessed. He looked at me with a hint of seriousness and replied, "My family are historically connected to King John and was in the service of the king at the time of the loss. Simon de Montfort, the builder of the original fortified manor house here, was a knight in arms with my now distant ancestor." I replied, "So who was your ancestor, may I ask?" "Sir Reginald de la Velle." I sat there deep in thought, knowing that I knew absolutely nothing about this knight, and indeed there weren't any documents that would attest to this man's existence as far as I am aware. I conveyed these thoughts to Devell, who replied, "The Devell family were part of a secret order of knights who have kept themselves and their activities a secret for centuries. For me to be here with you today would seem a betrayal, but now is the time to make ourselves known only to you." I was stunned at his admission and asked, "A Knight Templar type order, may I ask?" He laughed. "The Templars were not true to the faith nor true to God. They became lazy and greedy with their acquired wealth, and that greed lost Christianity in the Holy Land. On the other hand, we have never caved to monetary desire. So please tell me the name of your order." He shook his head and grasped the walking stick in one hand, which he then flicked across into the other and said, "The Order of St. Lazarus. The order came into being around 1119, and they grandly acquitted themselves in battle at the Siege of Acre in the Holy Land. It was a magnificent victory against Saladin by the Crusaders, with heavy losses to achieve this. The order itself was initially composed of Crusaders suffering from the disease of leprosy. Still, after the Templars were crushed, the order went into secrecy, with many former Templars joining this brother order, which in time lost its leper members." He continued, "The Lazarists of the true faith have continued without molestation for centuries. During the Siege of Acre, we took something more powerful and precious from Saladin than all of the jewels in Araby, which were regrettably lost in the Wash years later under King John." I sat there profoundly fascinated by his words, and whether it was divine interception or a hyperactive mind, I blurted out, "It wouldn't be the sceptre, would it?" His face contorted somewhat, as plainly I had hit the proverbial nail on the head, and he quickly responded, "It's not the actual sceptre. It is an item contained within the shaft, which is alien in origin. It contains a great power that we, as guardians, want to keep away from the hands and whims of humanity, as we believe it could cause great evil in this already unstable world. All I ask from you is that if we help you recover the treasure, you will allow us to remove the sceptre. There is no reward for us, other than that we can keep the world safe from itself." Having lived in the modern world for 50 years, I was dubious as anyone would be with any outrageous claim. Still, I decided that this either was an elaborate con, or indeed there was something in this treasure that threatened humanity. Despite agreeing to help Devell, I decided to withhold the manuscript describing the sceptre. After all, at this point, I had nothing but a fantastic story, and it all could be a fishing expedition by criminal opportunists to help them find the treasure for themselves. Instead, I took Devell's suggestion to meet again soon. after which he would loan me the medieval documentation in his possession, and that 2 weeks later we would meet to decide how to move further on this. If he keeps his side of the agreement, we could make meaningful progress locating the treasure, but life is never what it seems, as I soon discovered. I returned to my work in the document vault and found an interesting document written by a local monk who was a priest to the now long-gone village of East Hamlet, which disappeared following the Black Death in 1345. As an aside, the dead were buried in a giant plague pit close to where Montague House now stands, but I digress. The monk wrote about the deaths in detail and mentioned briefly administering the last rites to a delirious knight who claimed that great treasure was buried in the manor house cellar's tunnel. I naturally linked to John's treasure and researched in some detail an old plan of the cellar. But despite the rumour of a hidden tunnel, I could not find anything amiss that would have supported that claim. The vaulted cellar was built of limestone, rectangular in size and slightly larger in dimension than the more modern house built above. The plan was drawn by the architect of the present place and was dated 1721. Other than that, there was no further reference in existence that could shed additional light on the alleged treasure and hidden tunnel. Having not moved any further with the vault's medieval documents, I sought Celia's help with an idea from recent research that could help us find this secret tunnel, and that was the use of LiDAR 3D scanning technology. When I broached Celia on the discovery of a medieval document hinting at a tunnel, she agreed in principle, subject to approval by Lord Moorcroft, who excitedly offered to supply a team via Farley's themselves, who had trained operators on their staff. A few days later, a survey team attended the house and commenced a full scan of the cellar, revealing a 100-metre tunnel hidden behind one of the bastion walls. Fortunately, the tunnel wasn't in the vicinity of the document vault. A structural engineer for the survey team stated it was safe to remove the wall to access the inside without danger to the cellar or the house above. Lord Moorcroft appointed Celia as the relics officer for any finds in the tunnel, and Moorcroft himself insisted on being present when the wall was breached. Security here was a huge issue because of the potential the tunnel may have inside, so with proper planning it was agreed that the operation would occur in 2 weeks on a Monday, subject to secrecy. In my mind, which left me uncomfortably numb over the issues here, was the simple fact that the tunnel was part of an original fortified manor complex built after the Wash incident, and if the treasure was here in the tunnel, where had it been stored previously? In the interim, I was again visited by Devell, who brought a brown leather old-fashioned flap-over attaché case, from which he produced a folder containing many photocopies of medieval manuscripts about King John and the Wash. He handed them to me and said, "I think these may help you in your quest." He added, "These are from the Orders collection. As you can appreciate, I couldn't bring over the originals, but the quality is crisp and clear and should help." I thanked him and quickly scanned my eyes through the 30-odd copied documents. Afterwards, I placed them on a table and removed my reading glasses to say, "Tell me, Mr. Devell, what are your thoughts on a possible medieval tunnel in the cellar here? Some sources have suggested that." He laughed, put down his leather case and leaned slightly forward to say in a low but quite severe voice, "My dear sir, the tunnel is more than a suggestion. You recently completed a survey which confirms this, and even more, you plan to excavate the tunnel very shortly. Is my information correct?" I was stunned into silence. "Who told you this?" he retorted. "Am I right, Professor Housman? Am I right?" I replied sheepishly, "You have some good sources because it is true, but I plan to reveal more after the wall is breached." He relaxed a little and, in a much calmer voice, replied, "Very well, but I can tell you that the tunnel may well be a dry store for a missing esoteric book written by Gnostics in the 8th century, which once belonged in our library." He continued, "I previously mentioned Sir Simon de Montfort, the original house builder, and, of course, the cellars here. He used the tunnel to conceal mystic artifacts taken from the Holy Land on the same crusade as the Lazarists at the Siege of Acre. He also raided our Order's headquarters, stealing the missing book and several valuable documents. De Montfort was an occultist, and I fear what else may be contained in that area. Well, ancient books and manuscripts don't concern me in this regard, as I am tasked with locating the treasure. I promise to let you know if I find your missing book." Seemingly contented with the arrangement, he left. I heard nothing further from this man and reviewed the scans he shared. I was intrigued by a letter written in the mid-1300s from Roger de la Mare to a Lazarist scribe alleging that de Montfort had secretly concealed a gold and silver shaft with mercurial powers. I was starting to suspect that the blocked tunnel was vital. The other documents listed the contents of the royal baggage train, which I had never seen before, but other than what can be described as gossip, there needed to be more. Content to conclude my inquiries, I felt more frustrated as this elusive treasure vexed me. The breaching day for the cellar wall soon came around without delay. Lord Moorcroft rarely visited the house to supervise, as he put it, the dig in his cellar. Moorcroft was a sizable, ugly brute of a man who looked more like his Norman ancestors than the hereditary peers of today. Despite his ferocious looks, he was a very polite gentleman in his early 60s and stood well over 6 feet tall. As befitted his social status, he wore tweeds and smoked a large meerschaum pipe. A somewhat eccentric man indeed. Assembled in the cellar was the breaching team, who were miners by trade. They brought large hammer drills, sledgehammers and compressors to power the tools. The perimeter around where the planned breach was to be was shielded first from the rest of the cellar by heavy sheeting or curtains. Everyone was instructed to wear coveralls and breathing masks because of the envisaged dust generated during the breach. The man in charge, François Rossi, an Italian engineer from Milan, gave the go-ahead for the drilling team once the preparations were concluded. For the next 20 minutes, the team struggled to tear a hole into the fabric of the wall. The stonework was very professionally done, and the 1-foot thick limestone blocks were one of 2 walls, while the other, more difficult wall beyond was made of granite. There were secrets here that were not meant to be shared. Eventually, Rossi announced to Lord Moorcroft that a breach into the tunnel had been made. There was a 12-inch hole in the stonework into a dark void on the other side. Additionally, a foul smell permeated from the breach, which was tested for safety and declared safe. I was told it was stale air. Moorcroft took a flashlight and peered into the abyss. We stood with silent anticipation, but instead his lordship flashed the light about erratically and declared, "I can see absolutely nothing." He was reminded that the tunnel's depth was impenetrable for a handheld light until the team entered and followed the tunnel's length. We broke off from the cellar, leaving Rossi with his miners. At the same time, we all retired to the dining room, a large, opulent, oak-lined structure with a beautiful Italian marble fireplace and chandeliers. The antique mahogany dining table had 18 chairs and 2 carvers, easily seating 20 people. At Lord Moorcroft's request, we sat down to wait until Rossi had cleared sufficient room for us all to enter. Celia made arrangements with the kitchen, and large plates of salmon and tomato sandwiches and coffee were brought to the table. Moorcroft sat at the head of the table, and after extending his arms wide, he looked at the 15 or so faces of the team and roared, "Please!" as we took the cue to tuck in. The general conversation centered on our anticipation of what might be found. Of course, my main interests were any documents or clues to locate the treasure, but it had all become complicated with so many vested interests. Around 2 hours later, most were quietly bored when Rossi came out from the cellar, approached the table and said excitedly, "We are through the walls now, ladies and gentlemen." We clambered from our table to get back into the cellar. The general excitement now was palpable. Rossi took the lead with a powerful flashlight, which threw a bright shaft of light into the far gloom of the tunnel, which was neatly constructed in the Norman tradition, but without adornment to show an almost pristine rectangular passage. But as Lord Moorcroft said earlier, there was nothing to see as we continued onwards before eventually arriving near the far end wall of the tunnel. And there before our eyes was a stone sarcophagus which bore on the sandstone lid a beautifully carved sword cut into the stone itself. And this stone casket looked relatively new. unlike its contemporaries over the centuries. Using a winch, the team lifted the lid to discover inside a petrified body of a man wearing Crusader-type clothing. The skin was dried like parchment, and the dress was remarkably well preserved but fragile. Rossi interjected upon seeing this and said, "It must be the dry limestone walls in here, because normally I have seen similar in other conditions, and they have long since rotted away." "Indeed," replied Lord Moorcroft. "You only have to visit St Michan's Church in Dublin, Ireland, to see similar preservations. However, we must get a conservator to safeguard this body after the authorities have been notified." In all of the excitement, nobody bothered to check around the casket, with an old metal-strapped medieval chest standing alongside. Rather foolishly, Celia touched the metalwork, and the wood suddenly turned to dust as the metal straps collapsed into it. In the chest was a jewel-encrusted book, of which its pages too had fragmented into dust, and one that might have been the Gnostic writings Develle spoke of. All that remained preserved was a plain and flat metal copper crucifix engraved Sanctus Petrus. In English, this translated as St. Peter. Of course, the 11th century church of that name was nearby. Lord Moorcroft seemed happy with the results. Although the book was now lost, the gold-encrusted cover with diamonds, emeralds and rubies was worth a fortune. With his permission, I retained the copper crucifix for further investigation after clearing my possession with Celia, the appointed relics officer. The precious gold and jewelled book cover for safekeeping was also handed over to her pending a treasure trove review by the coroner's court. Like the tunnel, this was another dead end, so I retired to my office to review my options for going forward. The Church of St. Peter had stood for the best part of 900 years and was the family church of the de Montfort family. The crucifix and the connection to Simon de Montfort were compelling. I decided to attend the church with Develle, who, as a local to the area, was undoubtedly the right person to help answer this mystery. As agreed, we met outside the church the following morning. It was observed that St. Peter's was relatively small for a parish church, and we mused that perhaps it was used as a chapel of ease for pilgrims on their way to the nearby holy shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham, a rather plain-looking building with little adornment. We found the church was locked, but we were fortunate to get a key from a keyholder, and we let ourselves in. Develle looked the church up and down from the nave and remarked, "This seemingly unremarkable building has a strong round Saxon tower, which suggests that in part at least it dates from before the Norman invasion. Have you the crucifix?" I handed it to him, and he noted a slightly irregular shape. After perusing it briefly, he said, "I have a hunch. Look around the church's interior for any blank crucifix indentation or space which might accommodate the plate. Also, check for any unusual graffiti too." We split to cover both ends of the church. I was given the bell tower and nave, and he elected to examine the chancel, altar and vestry. While looking, I again felt that there was something else with us in that church. Again, I noticed something move across the nave from the corner of my eye, like what I experienced earlier in the document vault. The atmosphere felt quite heavy, but I could neither say nor think of what this thing might be. Regarding graffiti, there was a considerable amount on columns, walls and even pews. Most of it was that of bored churchgoers, but others were marks left by the original builders. After examining these areas in meticulous detail, I was about to give up when I decided to look under a beautifully carved oak coffer, which, when moved, revealed a black basalt grave marker plate with a crude outline carving of 2 knights on 1 horse, which was from memory, the seal of the Grand Master of the Knights Templar. Below that was a carved crucifix-shaped indentation, which was not dissimilar to that of the crucifix held by Develle. Both had signs of wear and cut between the crucifix, and the seal was the name of de Montfort. It looked like an ordinary grave ledger stone that had suffered the historic theft of an inlaid brass plate. But now I realize this could be the hiding place of valuable treasures or historical items, and the crucifix may be the key to confirming this. I called over to Develle, and he produced the copper crucifix which fitted the indentation perfectly, less the wear of centuries. The slightly irregular shape deliberately removed any uncertainty of its relevance. Unlike in fiction, the crucifix did not release any mechanism, it was merely a marker. Devell went outside and returned a few minutes later with 2 crowbars and small sledgehammers. With something of an urgency, he locked the church door internally and with my help proceeded to lever up one end of the heavy plate. Below lay darkness, which under the light of my phone revealed a long rectangular granite box which, upon removal, appeared hermetically sealed. As you would expect, it was cumbersome, but having struggled to haul it out with ropes, it contained something that must be of significant interest. Using a sharp knife, Devell broke the seal, a wax signet of the Templars, and removed the crude cover. Inside a lead-lined box was a metal baton around 2 feet long, and it was bulbous at one end and encrusted in crudely cut diamonds and rubies. The shaft was in silver, and the rest was in gold. Devell lifted the baton into the light and said, "Can you feel the incredible energy?" Sure enough, I felt this vibrancy in my body, giving me strength after my weary labour in retrieving it. Devell passed it to me, and I felt this incredible power which had portent for good or evil. He added, "This is King John's lost sceptre. De Montfort must have stolen it somehow from the baggage train." As I was holding the sceptre, the space around me turned into a thick, impenetrable mist that cleared shortly afterwards, and instead of being in the church, I was standing in what I perceived to be the Wash at low tide. I saw a long wagon train with the top part of the procession near the shore. With the colours displayed by horseback riders in medieval clothing, I am looking at the original baggage train of King John. I trembled with fear and anticipation. Just then, one of the riders, a knight and 2 soldiers on horseback, rode over to the unarmed driver of the king's baggage cart. I deduced a red flag with 3 golden lions by the colours displayed. The knight, who wore no definable colours, struck the driver with the broadsword, while the 2 soldiers dismounted and clambered aboard the cart whilst taking up the reins from the dead driver. He then instructed the rest of the train to continue while the 2 men removed a small trunk to which the knight had a key. I recognised it as the trunk found in the tunnel at Montague House. De Montfort unlocked the trunk, then removed the sceptre, and appeared to order the men to drive the cart back towards Norfolk. Other soldiers guarding the rest of the train, realising that theft was occurring, rode over with swords drawn to stop the thieves and the missing cart. At this point, matters became even stranger when de Montfort raised the sceptre to the sky, and a massive bolt of white energy struck the Wash and the entire train. With that, the knight and his men on the other cart suddenly disappeared as a wall of water struck the procession, causing men and animals to be sucked alive into the water and mud without a trace. I knew they had somehow escaped the train's demise when I suddenly found myself back in the church again. Devell clutched my arm and said, "Steady there! You looked for a moment to have slipped into a trance. You had a flashback, didn't you?" I was speechless for about a minute as my stunned senses recovered. I exclaimed, "Whoa, what was that? My God, it was incredible. I saw how King John's baggage train disappeared. You saw the train being sucked into the mud as the water came in, didn't you?" I replied, "Oh yes, and I think I saw de Montfort kill the driver of a baggage cart carrying the royal jewels and then witness the destruction of the rest of the train. It was truly epic. I think we should go to my home to talk, and there is much that I need to share with you." Before leaving, we put everything back into the hole and put the heavy plate back with the coffer on top. Nothing must arouse suspicion. Having never had the pleasure of seeing Devell's life beyond the medieval intrigued me, and so I followed him in my car to Hengeworth House, a rather attractive 19th century detached brick-fronted house, which was once, as I later discovered, a rectory. Pulling up behind his old MGB GT sports car on the driveway, we entered the house. Leaving my coat in the tiled hallway, we retired to the lounge, where an elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Irvine, went into the kitchen to prepare some tea with scones. As we sat in a rather nicely adorned lounge, with deep comfy club chairs and some delightful watercolours displayed on the walls, we relaxed and discussed my experience with the sceptre at length. Devell seemed less mysterious than before in his home environment, and I confess, I liked him. Once served with the cream teas and scones, we settled down to discuss our experiences in the church. As he preferred to be addressed now as Howard, he spoke about his ancestor, Sir Reginald de Lavelle. He was an honourable man who harboured suspicions about Sir Simon de Montfort's honesty and integrity. He was also one of the rebel barons who opposed King John's disastrous wars against King Philip II of France, and he, like others, was unhappy at his refusal to honour the Magna Carta. De Montfort, by contrast, was an evil, conniving man who played loose with his loyalties. Most nobles despised him, but John thought he was a good ally, which led to a disastrous consequence. He added, "The royal sceptre is of Roman origin, and it was then a lance made of gold and silver known as the Spear of Zeus. The Roman Empire thrived until the 4th century AD here in England. Around that time, the spear disappeared from Roman ownership until it was rediscovered during the Siege of Acre. It is regarded as being unpredictable and quite dangerous in the wrong hands. After the Wash debacle, the sceptre disappeared utterly, and we now know why. I cannot understand why he had to hide it and not use its immense power on King John to seek power. He died a few months afterwards, and the rest is history." Howard's in-depth knowledge riveted me, a knowledgeable man who understood his history well. But, as I explained to him, we must still resolve what we must do with the sceptre. We cannot hand it over to the state because of its unwieldy powers, and if it should fall into the hands of criminals. Howard stopped me at this juncture and said, "You probably won't like what I am about to tell you, but Lord Moorcroft, the descendant of Sir Simon de Montfort, is trying to obtain the sceptre for a nefarious purpose. Like his ancestor, he is a dangerous man of changing loyalties and completely evil." I was shocked. I had always felt Lord Moorcroft to be a reasonable man. But no, apparently not, according to Howard. I looked at him with grave concern and said, "How do you know that? He seemed okay to me." "Looks are always deceptive, my dear Professor. Did you know that Celia is my niece?" "I didn't," I responded. "She has been working undercover at Montague House for a couple of years, and Moorcroft was caught by her one evening chatting to an associate on the telephone. He admitted that he wanted the sceptre to change history and to allow him and his supporters to take over the country and the world. I also know that this all seems perfectly ridiculous, but we must get rid of the sceptre before he finds and releases evil upon the world, which we will never beat." We both decided to remove the sceptre from where it had remained hidden for centuries and to bury it safe from human discovery. It seemed a practical solution, but with hindsight there may have been better options. We both returned to the church the following day and were shocked to find a local police officer surveying a ransacked and damaged interior, which looked as though everything had been forcibly moved or broken. I approached the officer, who turned to me and said, "I'm sorry, sir, you'll have to leave the church because somebody broke in here overnight, and as you can see, they caused a lot of damage. The vicar and I think it is the work of so-called ghost hunters." I explained to the officer who I was, and as an expert in my field, I offered to give a quick visual assessment of what is missing within its historical context. The officer responded, "Okay, sir, but please don't touch or move anything, as the fingerprint boys will want to dust the church over for fingerprints." I agreed, but thought the chances of original fingerprint evidence being found in a building used daily by visitors and for worship would be impossible. Of course, my main interest was the Templar graveplate, because that is where the sceptre belonged. As I made my way through the overturned and broken pews and a smashed wooden lectern, I could see that the basalt slab was now in pieces, and the chest was open and on its side. I did not look further, but it was plain to see that someone had stolen the sceptre, which filled me with mortal dread. Having given the officer a rough appraisal without mentioning the sceptre, I left with Howard. We had to find who had stolen it. I saw Lord Moorcroft walking along the church path to the entrance as we returned to our cars. He seemed surprised to see me and stopped to say, "Hello, old boy, what brings you here? You never struck me as a religious kind of chap." I replied, "Actually, sir, I was here to survey the damage in the church. I was notified by a local this morning and came to see for myself." He said, "As you can appreciate, this is a family church, and naturally I am perturbed whether any damage has been caused to anything significant relating to my family." I replied, "I believe Sir Simon's grave plate has been smashed, but I wouldn't be able to say if anything is missing." He replied, "Quite, well, thank you. I'd better see the officer and make a statement." We both bid farewell, and I left. By this time, I was starting to believe something significant was wrong with everything happening. Contrary to Howard's concerns, Lord Moorcroft did not meet his expectations in my mind. Quite the reverse. Moorcroft decided to spend the next few weeks at Montague House because of the recent tunnel discovery and the church incident. He checked by my office once a day and was always exceptionally polite and friendly. I was starting to doubt Howard's assessment. During the interim, nothing particularly unusual happened concerning his lordship. He had returned to his business interests in London for a day and returned the following night. At this moment, I had no provable suspicions regarding him, and the longer the sceptre remained undetected, the more I worried about whoever had the sceptre and for what purpose. Sure enough, Howard returned to me a few days later. We met at his home and discussed at length a rather pressing situation. He was optimistic considering the circumstances and said that Moorcroft was planning to use the sceptre in a black arts ritual in which a medieval location was to be used. Several others were attending from London, and the sceptre was to give the adherents special powers through the chants of ancient Gnostic scripts. I asked how he had learnt of that, and he told me that Celia had bugged his office and could monitor conversations he had had with his colleagues over the phone or across the internet. I suggested I link up with Celia to work on this together. He strongly advised me not to, as it might arouse suspicion from Moorcroft, but he assured me I would receive a warning in due time. 3 days later, Howard told me the ritual would be performed that night at midnight in the tunnel with the sceptre. He asked that I smuggle him into the house via the merchant's door, which should be unlocked at 11 p.m. I agreed to arrange this for him, and I was later able to take him into the house. Fortunately, at that hour no staff was around, so Howard's infiltration went very smoothly. I took him to my office on the first floor, where we discussed a strategy. My plan was, once we had confirmed that Moorcroft had the sceptre, I would trigger the fire alarm to create a distraction and would then remove the object from his possession. But this was a poorly thought out plan because we didn't know where he was hiding the sceptre. Most importantly, we had no confirmation that he had the item in his immediate possession. It was all a gamble that would play out in a manner I could not imagine. At around 11:50 p.m, Howard and I went down to the basement tunnel. Moorcroft nor indeed anyone was there, and I wondered exactly how this alleged event would play out. Howard told me to observe from a safe distance the tunnel entrance, whilst he slipped off briefly to contact his niece Celia, using the telephone in the soundproofed document room. Precisely on the dot at midnight, I saw a robed figure enter the entrance to the tunnel, followed by 6 other robed figures carrying a trunk and a large book. Howard was right. There is a secret ceremony, and Moorcroft plans to commit a terrible evil. I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder as I was about to get Howard. As I turned, I heard a quiet but emphatic shh, and was deeply shocked to see Lord Moorcroft standing there with a smile. He whispered to me that I should not worry and that all was about to be revealed. With that, a team of security men rallied behind him. Moorcroft said to all concerned, "Wait a moment, I want to make sure they have the sceptre before we move against them." As they quietly watched, the trunk was placed on the ground, and from within came the sceptre. The leading figure opened the book and started to read a Latin incantation, whilst another held up the sceptre. I recognized the reader's voice. It was unmistakably Howard's. Damn it, I thought, he has been leading us along all the time, and now he has the sceptre. As he spoke in Latin, that same sensation of catching something from the corner of my eye appeared once more and in a greater force. This time it manifested as wispy, misty grey human shapes that swirled around Howard and his group with a depth and intensity I had never seen. The others in his group repeated the words of the chant, so I realized that something dreadful was about to happen. I took the initiative and lunged forward at the group by grabbing the sceptre before tossing it to Lord Moorcroft, who in turn started to speak in Latin and curse Howard's group. The effect was that everyone present and I were thrown to the stone floor, while the swirling mist surrounded Howard and his followers before consuming them into nothingness. There were no screams, no shouting, just nothing other than an overwhelming smell of sulphur as they all disintegrated. After a few seconds, the tunnel was again empty and Lord Moorcroft helped me to my feet. He said, "By Jove, old boy, that was a close one." I dusted myself down and asked if Lord Moorcroft could explain what had happened. He took me to his office in the library, and we sat down by the fireplace with a scotch while he explained everything to me. "I believe he told you about his sect, the Lazarus, is that correct?" I responded by sharing all that Howard had told me. He sat there quietly in thought while swirling his scotch around in his glass, and when I finished he replied, "You are almost there with the story, but there are some inaccuracies with what he told you. During the siege of Acre, his ancestor, Sir Reginald de la Velle, plundered the city and murdered many of its inhabitants. During the process, he stole what was to become King John's sceptre, which was then named the Spear of Acre. The lance contained an unknown element which seemingly conferred on the holder great powers. Fortunately, because of the pace of the siege, de la Velle didn't realise its significance when he quickly handed it over to King Richard the Lionheart of England, who visited Acre shortly after its conquest. Preferring to spend his time away from England on crusades, Richard arranged for the lance to be taken to England, which was shortened and made into the royal sceptre. I listened with fascination as he continued. De la Velle later found out its true significance, and when he heard of King John crossing the Wash, he decided to steal it and blame it on my ancestor, Sir Simon de Montfort. Worse still, de la Velle used the sceptre to destroy all evidence by making the sea destroy the baggage train. He sipped some whiskey and continued. Suffice it to say, as a result, a more potent force of knights attacked de la Velle's camp, and the sceptre was retaken and later hidden in the church. They also had a satanic book of the dead, which was believed to have originated in the Great Library of Babylon. That was also taken and hidden in a sealed-up tunnel we recently opened. They didn't want both items to remain in one place, and that I didn't know. He stopped briefly to reflect momentarily and continued. And the power of the Lazarites was broken. Their survivors over the centuries have been attempting to restore to them the sceptre, which thankfully has ended with the destruction of Howard Celia and their sycophant followers. Tell me, I asked, what will happen now? He replied as a matter of fact, the sceptre will be buried in the Wash, and sadly for you, Professor, the work to find the crown jewels and treasure will be abandoned. I employed you to find the sceptre. The original jewels are long lost, but I suspected the sceptre wasn't. I am not unhappy, as the jewelled book cover is worth at least £1 million and will be donated to the British Museum for others to enjoy. And best of all, my family name has been vindicated. I never saw Lord Moorcroft again, although he compensated me well for my troubles, and I later, after a break, returned to my work at Cambridge University. Despite all that had happened, I realized the events that played out in my life had to remain secret because nobody would ever believe me. The end.